Welcome to the video digest of the Asian Agricultural Climate Finance Summit, which took place in November 2021. We've taken 5 hours of detailed discussion and distilled it into a 30-minute video briefing. It includes an abridged version of the keynote presentation by Jonny Casey from CASA on climate-smart agricultural investment opportunities, and Erin Sweeney from Grow Asia on sustainable agricultural investment in the ASEAN region. We then have four-minute investors' perspectives on mobilizing $100 billion a year of climate finance, working towards net zero, improving agricultural resilience, and nature-based solutions. CASA would like to thank the participants for contributing their insights to the Asian Agricultural Climate Finance Summit. These insights will shape the upcoming priorities for CASA and our event partners, Grow Asia. The first film is an abridged version of the opening presentation by Jonny Casey, Climate Change Manager at CABI. This presentation is based on CASA's research into private finance investment opportunities in climate-smart agriculture technologies. It can be found in the evidence section of the CASA website.
From the discussions that we had with investors and innovators, we identified that there were 8 technologies which showed significant potential for further investments and profitability among investors across Asia and Africa. What we also identified were some of the innovative business models which are helping to scale some of these climate smart agriculture technologies across the region. So some of those businesses were, for example, looking at ways of diversifying their revenues to boost profits and improve business resilience and sustainability. So in some cases, that included a shift away from just service provision or just retailing products to also looking at value addition through alternative services. For example, bundling services together was seen as significantly more attractive, both to investors and to clients and consumers as well. So if we look at digital platform technologies which enable farmers and SMEs to access agricultural advice and market services, where more than one particular offer was included, whether that was through the provision of financial services alongside agricultural advice, or access to market information or weather information, or being able to purchase inputs or otherwise sell their produce, was increasing revenues and increasing the willingness to pay and increasing the scale of these operations. We also identified across the 2 regions that we looked at, India was showing the greatest growth in climate smart agricultural technologies uptake and investment. And that was kind of underpinned by a strong digital infrastructure within India and familiarity with digital tools and technologies as well compared to other areas. There were also seemed to be lower entry barriers for investors as a single country, although there are obviously differences between the states within India. There seemed to be a much larger market where technologies could scale more rapidly than compared to, for example, in East Africa. And we also identified that there was a growing awareness and demand among farmers and SMEs and indeed global businesses for these technologies to help overcome some of these challenges. I mentioned earlier there were 8 technologies which were identified as showing significant potential for investment. So these were solar-powered drip irrigation, so irrigation technologies which minimize the volume of water that's required to irrigate crops, and those are seeing significant investments, particularly in Asia. We also saw real interest in biocontrol products, so moving away from chemical pesticides for control of pests and diseases on crops. Biocontrol products are seen as a nature positive solution that's attracting real investment as consumer demand for pesticide-free or otherwise nature-positive agricultural products increases. There is a real potential in solar-powered cold chain storage as well. So modular units which are able to chill goods and keep them fresh and preserve produce for longer. And this has been seen as a particularly strong adaptation strategy in areas where there's increased humidity and high temperatures due to climate change. In addition to drip irrigation, we're also seeing some interest in smart irrigation. So that's irrigation that makes use of on-farm sensors and typically also with meteorological data to identify when is the most optimal time and highest volume of water to provide to crops. So it's very adaptive to shifting climatic conditions and intra-seasonal changes as well, to really optimize both the yield that can be achieved and also to optimize the water availability as well. So seeing this is particularly of interest in areas where there have been persistent droughts. So we saw strong examples of that in South Africa, and there are, I'm sure, many cases across Asia. We also saw some real interest, including from a lot more venture capital in digital climate smart advisory technologies as well. So these are typically mobile-based technologies, also tablet-based technologies, which are providing advisory services to farmers to help them to understand how they can both shift towards more low carbon production, but also how to build resilience in their farming practices to the impacts of climate change. We also saw interest in slightly different way of investing in terms of SMEs in biodigesters. So these are typically manufactured locally, so it doesn't have quite the scale that we've seen elsewhere in terms of a single player being able to sort of scale their products across the market, but there are lots of different entry opportunities for biodigesters that can be made. And these have multiple revenue streams that are available, which make them a particularly attractive opportunity. Not only can they produce biogas, which can be burned locally or sold, but they're also producing organic matter, which can be used to improve the farming practices. The final two were biocoatings. So these are biological sort of sprays which can be used to coat fresh fruit and vegetables to improve their shelf life and prevent waste, ensure that they don't perish under increased temperatures and humidity levels due to climate change. The final one was on solar drying and processing as well. So small technologies which can help partially or fully process goods to improve their income as well and their profitability. So what were some of the challenges? Well, many of these are common, and we've reflected some of the known issues that have been seen in other research. That there's limited investment so far in that growth stage. So there's a lot of investment in early stage an ideation area of new technologies and in mature markets, but there is still that missing middle where venture capital in particular would be particularly helpful. We've also seen limited support for SMEs at that level. And there is, in some areas, there are still some demand side constraints for farmers and SMEs too.
The second film is an abridged version of the presentation by Erin Sweeney from Grow Asia, where she sets out the ASEAN guidelines for sustainable impact in food, agriculture, and forestry.
I'm looking forward to sharing about the updates on the work that we're doing together with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, the Food, Agriculture, and Forestry Organization of the United Nations, and the ASEAN Secretariat. We all know there's a huge opportunity in ASEAN for increased investment in agriculture and forestry as land use sectors, both that ag and forestry represent a significant portion of GDP, employ over 1/6 of the population in ASEAN, and represent a $205 billion per year investment opportunity when we're specifically looking at regenerative agriculture and traceability solutions. We do see a really exciting increase in the last few years, but also just in the last few months in the movement toward more sustainable practices among agribusinesses and investors across the region. So since 2018, 8 out of the 12 companies that received sustainability-linked loans in ASEAN were in the agriculture sector. We also know that last week, actually, the ASEAN Taxonomy Board released the first version of the ASEAN Taxonomy for Sustainable Finance, making ASEAN one of the few countries and regions to establish such a taxonomy. And in the document, the contributors note that the agriculture, forestry, and fisheries, including land use change sector, is the #1 material sector in contributions to overall greenhouse gas emissions. I'd also just like to highlight that in the ASEAN Sustainable Finance State of the Market report published earlier this year, we saw that ASEAN green, social, and sustainability debt reached a record high of $12.1 billion in 2020. So while we see this fantastic opportunity, we also know that all of you are facing significant barriers, both as investors, but you also see that your investees face significant barriers as well. So in fact, what I'd like to share with you today is one small piece of the solution, but that could have significant impact in the ASEAN region, which are these guidelines that GrowAsia is working with partners to implement. A few years ago, the 10 heads of state adopted this voluntary guidance framework to attract more sustainable investments that balance the rights and interests of different stakeholders, create this guidance framework, which is actually a reference point going forward for all future investments in the agriculture, food, and forestry sectors. The guidelines are very relevant and timely, aligned with more than 10 SDGs. They're applicable across many value chains, which is attractive to agribusinesses with multiple crops, as well as those of you investing into all different types of agriculture and forestry sectors and crops. And the guidelines are specific to the ASEAN context with a greater focus on these areas you see on the screen. And perhaps most importantly, the guidelines are voluntary for now, but will be embedded into national policy. And this is the reason that GrowAsia feels so strongly about the promotion of these guidelines across the region. Because these guidelines were adopted by the 10 ASEAN ministers of agriculture and forestry, it means that each of those countries has then committed to embedding these 10 principles of the guidelines into their national policy frameworks, which turns a voluntary guidance document into law. So starting in 2020, GrowAsia and our partners have been offering ASEAN member states an opportunity to apply for technical assistance, where our partner will actually provide legal guidance in how to adjust and to embed the ASEAN RIE guidelines into national policy, but also to look at the implementation of that policy and make sure that it's happening on the ground. And I'd be very excited to share with you that 5 ASEAN member states have already requested that technical assistance just a few months after the offer went out to them. We're looking forward to supporting investors like yourselves and our agribusiness partners across the region to prepare for that policy change, to better respond to market trends, to unlock sustainable financing, communicate sustainability commitments, be resilient in the face of COVID, and learn from GrowAsia's network of over 580 partners across the region. We established when we drafted these ASEAN guidelines with all of those partners back in 2017, 2018, that there are roles for many different actors to play. But of course, today we're here to talk about the role for financial investors and how you can incentivize your investees and your portfolio companies to use more climate smart practices in agriculture and forestry value chains. So I'll leave you with a quick overview of the work that GrowAsia is going to be doing over the next 9 years in order to facilitate the measurable increase in this kind of private sector investment that we aim to see through the ASEAN RIE guidelines. So that includes the policy services that I've already talked about. We're putting together a learning program to train people to become experts in the application of these guidelines at the local level. We'll be holding regional events, and we'll be sure that all of you receive invitations to those events and workshops in the coming months. And very importantly, we are managing investor engagement through a series of case studies, which will start to come out in about 2 weeks with 14 different agribusinesses and highlighting best practices across the region, as well as promoting a self-assessment alignment tool. But we would just encourage you to continue to engage with us after today's session, as many of you already are, perhaps by showcasing an investment in that case study series, joining our learning program, joining these events to benefit from others' learnings and best practices, and perhaps even contributing insights for policy dialogues.
The following 4 films set out the ideas and insights that emerged from the 4 thematic discussion groups. What are the opportunities for better public-private collaboration to realise $100 billion per annum in climate financing? You will hear a quick summary of the issues from Jonny Casey, Climate Change Manager at CABI, and then Cedric Rameau from Climate Bonds Initiative will share the investors' response.
So at the moment, less than 1% of climate finance is directed towards climate smart agriculture technologies, when agriculture accounts for 24% of all global emissions and is also one of the sectors most vulnerable to climate impacts. Similarly, other areas of private finance in particular are particularly low in smallholder farming contexts. We talk about mobilizing 100 billion per year for climate finance globally. But actually, the real financial need for adaptation alone in just low-income countries is estimated at around 300 billion per year.
There is a global trend of rising volumes in the issuance of green bonds that will reach $1 trillion of annual issuance by next year. However, agriculture is not really participating in this trend. And this is it is difficult to issue bonds because of the nature of the sector, which is constituted of very small stakeholders. So it's very hard to do a bond for small farmers. And one way to go around that problem is to focus on the agricultural banks that could be a relay for issuing a bond to the market and on lending to small SMEs and small stakeholders. And there is another opportunity, which is to use securitization techniques where you create pools of projects which are relatively similar in nature, maybe because of the technologies that they are using or the geography they are focusing on, and then using concessional capital to de-risk the pool of investments by, for example, having a first loss guarantee coming from concessional funds, and then that way you can crowd in some private investments and really scale up the lending. And the due diligence by DFIs is actually very instrumental because private investors are reassured that the proper standards have been used in terms of protecting environment and social characteristics of the projects. Then we went on to say that banks are underutilized and non-bank financial institutions are also underutilized in this market, and that's something that could be playing an important role using public funds. Another way to scale up this financing for agriculture is you can go into a country, meet the local farmers, ask them what they need, and then do some pilot projects with them. But that's a very low impact because it's always small projects, pilots. It doesn't have scale. Another way to go about it is to go to market leaders like Barry Callebaut or Unilever or even Netafim, which is a leader in drip irrigation, and then use those organizations to issue bonds to the market, raise capital, and then deploy at scale their products through innovative offers like we've seen electric vehicles offered as a subscription, for example, or there could be an association with retailers to offer some convenient financing for small stakeholders to take on drip irrigation solutions or rooftop solar, small-scale off-grid equipment that could provide renewable energy. And the last point was about the different data that is needed to scale up the response from investor, accessing measurement of biomass on the ground so that investors can see their impact on protecting against deforestation, as well as data around having reforestation that is not monoculture, but that really mixes different species so that the environment is not at risk of all the problems that could come with monoculture.
What are the investment opportunities for climate-smart agri-tech for reaching net zero? You will hear a quick summary of the issues from Jonny Casey, Climate Change Manager at CABI, and then John Friedman from AgFunder and Matt Haig from CASA will share the investors' response.
In terms of reaching net zero, as I mentioned, the role of agriculture here is absolutely critical when it accounts for nearly a quarter of all greenhouse gas emissions. Although forestry and livestock are the main sources, crop agriculture is also a major part of that, including how it's changing land use and clearing forests for further expansion. So we need to identify what the opportunities are to leapfrog to more efficient and low carbon production systems and systems which are more resilient to climate change.
Essentially, I think we were exploring just from our own experiences, from our own investment bodies, the challenges of where we are today, and is our portfolio perhaps set up to be able to answer, like, we are able to deliver net zero, or we are contributing X. My own sort of sharing from our side, we invest sort of across the agri-food sort of value chain and also early stage. So perhaps we could identify where, as a business scales, they would be able to deliver X amount of savings in terms of whether it's CO2 emissions, or I guess for the topic today, we're focused more on net zero. But to have the sort of the toolkit and reporting methodology down pat, so that as the businesses scale, they can actually be quantifying this. How do we capture that sort of collectively, as I said, because not all of the companies that we're investing in, or even Tambusu's fund, are necessarily addressing or working towards net zero. So I think we're just sort of identifying where we might sort of fall short. Sources of capital, I think, was an interesting topic of conversation. The sort of evolution of the sort of principles, or the capital allocators, the impact investment mindset, and how that sort of might vary from one region to another, the sort of level of education that is sort of required still in the market, and oftentimes the challenge that we're faced as, let's say, GPs, in terms of the commercial versus sort of impact performance, whether or not there is a trade-off. Is this still considered sort of philanthropy versus the sort of return profile that we should be looking to achieve in a venture technology type fund?
So we talked sort of briefly around some things that we could be looking at right now. I think in the production of novel foods, and then also looking more towards sort of cold chain, so reducing waste is a key element of working on this. So we start to reduce the amount of production that is created in the first place, looking 10 years ahead on how we're going to be reusing and recycling products more generally. So not necessarily just in the agri-food part, but further upstream. So we can start to cut down on that initial demand for raw materials. The sort of fundamental challenges are around whether markets are believers in the greenhouse gas emissions methodologies that various investees are using to justify their investments. I think improving the believability of the narrative that we're selling is really key. And then in terms of sort of partners, we were thinking that there's perhaps an opportunity to get fund managers collaborating, so that we start to sort of coalesce thinking on the credibility of different sort of climate indicators. This is sort of as part of a broader conversation around impact. One of the areas that's the big impediment to impact, moving that narrative into mainstream investment. So one of the things to do there is to improve the evidence base. But with these new taxonomies, we're moving very much into this direction of non-financial reporting, which will strengthen, I think, the persuasiveness of the narrative around climate change and net zero.
What are the issues that investors need to explore in relation to nature positive agriculture? You'll hear a quick summary of the issues from Jonny Casey, Climate Change Manager at CABI, and then Sami Khan from CDC Group and Trilandra Mishra from NTU Singapore will share the investors' response.
Nature-based solutions are one of the areas which are identified as helping us to address both adaptation and mitigation within agriculture. And they help avoid the expensive grey infrastructure that is often seen and often not as appropriate for smallholder farmers. One of the challenges that no single product or service is able to address these issues, and it takes a wide variety of stakeholders to be involved as well, which makes investment slightly trickier when there is no one size fits all, and we need slightly more bespoke implementation in different areas.
What are the main constraints for investing in nature-based solutions? A couple of areas that have been flagged by the team are the lack of clear role models and examples in the natural based solution space. I think there's an opportunity to bring in new quantifiable evidence to promote this further. As far as the climate debate is concerned, unfortunately, agriculture is a new entrant to this. It's kind of unfortunate, but I think nonetheless, there's a lot of focus on addressing the issue of sustainability in agriculture. But there is a bit of a lack of understanding on exactly what NBS as the acronym is all about. I think there are a bit of communication challenges that we need to deal with. There's a bit of struggle to raise financing, especially for the smallholders who are definitely most vulnerable. Possibly more funds may be required into these regions and other regions like Latin America. For instance, CDC is going to be entering Southeast Asia market. And I'll hope to have follow-on discussions with some of the other colleagues on this call on how we could potentially deploy nature-based solutions, regenerative agriculture in certain select countries in Southeast Asia. The other point that was raised by the members is how to pivot or adapt models from other regions to suit Asia in particular. How do we account for below ground biodiversity? There was also a remark about silos between investors and conservation focused organizations, despite the intersection overlaps in carbon markets. On the second point on what needs to happen for more private capital focus on nature-based solutions, whilst it's recognized that a number of funds are flowing into the conservation efforts, there's still need for investment in replanting and pushing forward the regenerative agriculture practices agenda at the farm level, at the grassroots level, to achieve the conservation goals that specifically benefits smallholders. It was also noted that the multinational brands or global brands are realizing the value is tied with more responsible environmental stewardship versus adoption of NBS at the smallholder level. We have seen this, for instance, when we talk to some of the UK PLC multinational retailers on the importance of walking the talk, and the consumers are, of course, more focused on sustainable and ethical sourcing. Then, of course, we want to focus on increasing smallholder productivity. And the third point, what are the most interesting nature-based solutions and business models for private capital finance? There was some discussion on leveraging on standards becoming more important to consumers. There was some discussion on drip and micro irrigation, more resilient seeds to address some of the issues that we'll be facing down the road, especially in economies, emerging economies, where the farmers are more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in an outsized manner. I think the discussion is still work in process. There's on the responsibilities side, there was acknowledgement of the fact that there needs to be more sharing information, creating a sort of a structured menu of integrated approaches that are, that can facilitate cross-sharing information.
Thanks, Sammy. In terms of any other organization we were talking about, like organizations, NGOs such as Grow Asia and CASA, and this is where they can be good examples, and they can of course integrate among all different smallholders and showcase examples.
What are the issues that investors need to explore for action planning on agricultural resilience? You will hear a quick summary of the issues from Jonny Casey, Climate Change Manager at CABI, and then Shuin Tang from Permata Capital will share the investor's response.
And last one is about building resilience and adaptive capacity. So this is absolutely vital for supply chain functioning and avoiding business interruption from climate shocks and stresses. And as the impacts of climate change grow, demand for improved resilience and adaptive capacity will grow too. Climate smart agriculture technologies are a critical component of this, but they're only part of the solution alongside knowledge and better services and climate information services. Adaptation benefits often accrue over longer periods and not always directly to investors, So how can we change the current model so that we can attract greater private investment into building resilience and adaptive capacity?
The first one was really around the point that there are indeed many kind of emerging technologies which are interesting, right? I think some of the cool things that we discussed was using kind of backpacks for cattle to absorb methane, adding seaweed to cattle feed for similar purposes. These are just examples, right, of the types of technologies that are emerging, but how do we actually get channel more investment into the space, right? And I think again it comes back to improving the narrative, the data set, our messaging around the opportunity, right? That can be gained from investing in this particular sector. The second area is around kind of blended finance structures, right, to catalyze more investment into agri SMEs and companies reaching smallholder farmers. The third one was around technical assistance. It's a solution that has an endpoint, right? But I think in the near term, it is needed to, I think, help investors firstly understand in more detail, like what exactly is the climate risk in their portfolios, right? And I think a lot of investors have some knowledge, right, that there's a risk out there, but have not really, been able to kind of really quantify it or pin it down, right? So there's increased perception of risk, which is maybe hindering them or hampering them from investing more into this sector. There's clearly also the need for technical assistance at the enterprise level and also the farmer level. Another kind of broad idea that we had is, this idea of having, I guess, more endowment / permanent capital or open-ended vehicles to fund different types of activities. I think obviously we all recognize that agricultural and climate change investment is a bit of a long-term game, right? And the traditional kind of 10-year closed-ended fund structures might not necessarily be the best forms to really channel more investment into the space. I think we've seen more creative things recently in terms of different kind of permanent capital or perpetual vehicles being set up. How do we channel that to things such as operational maintenance, right, for farmers? Really important issue, but very underfunded, or other important kind of themes or sectors within the agricultural resilience sector. Point 5. Ultimately the cost or needs to be passed on to consumers, right? Or there needs to be different ways to incentivize farmers to adopt these technologies, which could ultimately be borne by the consumers, similar to fair trade and organic, right? Over time, I think consumers became gradually accustomed with the concept of paying more for those certified types of products. How do we also kind of maybe apply a kind of climate lens, right, to that as well? I think, again, this is back to maybe TA, right, the value of really conducting climate risk assessments to identify both the risks as well as the opportunities for businesses. And I think having that really concrete understanding up front does, I think, kind of motivate and help businesses and investors see clearly the types of things that need to be done, right, to mitigate those risks or capture those opportunities.
The CASA programme is proud to be building partnerships across the world to drive investment for climate-resilient agri-food systems. Visit the events page, past events section, to hear other expert viewpoints shared in the CASA 4x4s and webinar series.